Hi, everyone. Bob here again for our lecture, and this is a bit of a longer one, so I'm going to get right into it. The title is Liberatory Research, and we've talked a little bit about these topics in this class earlier on. The idea is how to do research from a liberatory perspective, liberatory psychology perspective. Research has been a part of oppression for a long, long time and continues to be. And so I'm going to go through how to think about that oppressive research, and then if there's possibilities for more liberatory approaches to research. So let's start off with this question: what is science? And we take science for granted as it's like some kind of thing that is well established and that it's just one thing no matter where you are. But science is actually um, possibly very different things. Some things that count as science are contradictory to one another. So let's go through this. So the Science Council defines science as the pursuit and application of knowledge and understanding of the natural and social world following a systematic methodology based on evidence. And this definition is actually probably more broad than you might have defined it for yourself, or how it gets defined in the mainstream. What I find interesting here is the second part of it, a systematic methodology based on evidence. So it's an observation of the world and a pursuit of knowledge, and then an application of that knowledge based on systematic methodology, based on evidence. So that evidence, the systematic methodology is basically setting up a method, and that method we traditionally in psychology think about as within a laboratory, but that doesn't need to be the case. It can be in the field, and it can be basically anywhere in the world. And what's important here is that there is a thinking through of the method and coming up with a method. Evidence can be from quantitative data, numbers, but it can also be people's experiences in the world. That's evidence if it's studied systematically. So this is a much broader idea of science, and one that I like to start off because then we can think about science in different ways. So historically, yeah, how the application and how evidence that I have highlighted there gets defined is what counts as science. And I'm going to go through some different ways of defining application and evidence. So the dominant way, the historically dominant way that science has been defined and how evidence and application is defined is through positivism. So let's talk about positivism. Positivism means only so-called factual knowledge from the senses is trustworthy. And so only things that we can positively see and positively measure, not necessarily plus or minus, but that we can for sure like knock on or see with our senses. So, or measure, in some way. So things like people's stories and narrative and people's account don't usually get qualified as factual knowledge. However, I think there's a lot to be learned from people's stories. And so that idea that people's stories matter and that there's knowledge outside of the things that we can point to or measure starts to put some cracks into positivism. Sorry, that should say, in psychology, positivism arose with behaviorism and a desire to be, quote unquote, real science. So psychology about 100 years ago was making a push to be counted as a real science, and it had this thing called physics envy, which is a sort of idea of sort of making fun of psychology, but I think in a way that is true. This sort of like desire for something more rational, and also that it's a gendered thing as well, that was seen as like a harder science, more masculine. So there is this idea of misogyny in psychology's push for be counted as real science. Um, and that has stuck. So psychology for a good solid 30 or 40 years, and the psychodynamic schools were not were a big part of psychology, but then sort of got whittled out and pushed to the side because they were not considered real science. So we can analyze the theoretical assumptions of positivism and the effects of positivism on the world, and show that positivism is a choice. It's a type of system of study of the world, but it's not the only type of science that can exist. So what does positivism look like, positivist science? We can look at these elements, these basically assumptions, the philosophy of positivism and its effects on the world. And we can look at it. So this is the philosophy of science. And we can look at what are the goals of positivism, what's the ontology or its assumptions about how the world works, what is the goals of that science. So that's different from the socio-political goals, although they're interrelated. And then what's the epistemology? How does positivism think about knowledge and knowledge production? So positivism's socio-political goals is connected to the progress of humanity through accumulation of knowledge. Positivism arose during the Enlightenment period. And so it's connected to this humanism, progress of humanity ideas. And it makes assumptions that if we can accumulate knowledge, that if knowledge builds on itself, then that will progress all of humanity. And that's a socio-political goal. There's ideas of what counts as important to society within that. That idea of progress is connected to a socio-political project, namely the Enlightenment. So what is positivism? What are assumptions about how the world works and how science can work in a society? Well, it makes assumptions that humans act rationally when they have the facts. That is an assumption of positivism. And so it's connected to the socio-political goal that if you give humans all the facts, then they will take it in. And this idea of rational choice acting, they will, once humans have the facts, they will act in their best interest. And I think we see how that's not necessarily the case, that seems to be a little bit of a fallacious assumption. That I think we can come up with a lot of examples of facts don't necessarily motivate people to act, that people ignore facts, and that people don't always act rationally or as if they're apart from their emotions. So I think there's some cracks there in positivist assumptions of ontology. Positivist assumptions of what science should do in order to promote the socio-political goal is to get objective data, best if it's quantified and best if you can generalize it. So positivism makes this assumption about science that this is connected to the ontology's world, that humans can act rationally if they can be objective, if they can be impartial and separate themselves from the world. And so much of science is the creation of these scientists, this idea of the scientist as neutral and objective, and this idea that science can produce data that is neutral and objective. And I'll get to that in the next slide, actually. The epistemology, or what counts as knowledge and how is knowledge produced, that there's an emphasis on neutrality, that research is value-free, that it's apolitical, and that the researcher controls the bias, their own bias and the bias of the conclusions and data. And I'm also gonna start to critique this in the next couple of slides as well. So critique number one, no such thing as total control of bias. And actually this is physics that presents, I mean, this critique of this comes from many fields, and I think feminist critiques of this are really good. And I think that even within science, or the so-called, hard science has critiqued this idea of you can't actually control bias. And we see that through the quantum quandary, and through this question that was asked 100 years ago, what is light? So this question was posed, and it was a great question of physics 100 years ago. Is light a particle or is it a wave? At the smallest level, is what light all these small little particles, these little photons, or is it a wave? And scientists, physicists were finally able to have the technology to start to measure this. And this video describes it better than I can. So let's watch this video. It's a 5-minute video. I should also say the video is kind of corny, but I think it gives us what we need to understand about this.
And here we are, the granddaddy of all quantum weirdness, the infamous double-slit experiment. To understand this experiment, we first need to see how particles, or little balls of matter, act. If we randomly shoot a small object, say a marble, at the screen, we see a pattern on the back wall where they went through the slit and hit. Now, if we add a second slit, we would expect to see a second band duplicated to the right. Now, let's look at waves. The waves hit the slit and radiate out, striking the back wall with the most intensity directly in line with the slit. The line of brightness on the back screen shows that intensity. This is similar to the line the marbles make. But when we add the second slit, something different happens. If the top of one wave meets the bottom of another wave, they cancel each other out. So now there is an interference pattern on the back wall. Places where the two tops meet are the highest intensity, the bright lines, and where they cancel, there is nothing. So, when we throw things, that is, matter, through two slits, we get this, 2 bands of hits. And with waves, we get an interference pattern of many bands. Good so far. Now, let's go quantum. An electron is a tiny, tiny bit of matter, like a tiny marble. Let's fire a stream through one slit. It behaves just like the marble, a single band. So, if we shoot these tiny bits through 2 slits, we should get, like the marbles, 2 bands. What? An interference pattern. We fired electrons, tiny bits of matter through. But we get a pattern like waves, not like little marbles. How? How could pieces of matter create an interference pattern like a wave? It doesn't make sense. But physicists are clever. They thought, maybe those little balls are bouncing off each other and creating that pattern. So they decide to shoot electrons through one at a time. There is no way they could interfere with each other. But after an hour of this, the same interference pattern is seen to emerge. The conclusion is inescapable. The single electron leaves as a particle, becomes a wave of potentials, goes through both slits, and interferes with itself to hit the wall like a particle. But mathematically, it's even stranger. It goes through both slits and it goes through neither. And it goes through just one and it goes through just the other. All of these possibilities are in superposition with each other. But physicists were completely baffled by this. So they decided to peek and see which slit it actually goes through. They put a measuring device by one slit to see which one it went through and let it fly. But the quantum world is far more mysterious than they could have imagined. When they observed, the electron went back to behaving like a little marble. It produced a pattern of two bands, not an interference pattern of many. The very act of measuring or observing which slit it went through meant it only went through one, not both. The electron decided to act differently, as though it was aware it was being watched. And it was here that physicists stepped forever into the strange, never world of quantum events. What is matter? Marbles or waves? And waves of what? And what does an observer have to do with any of this? The observer collapsed the wave function simply by observing.
Okay. Let me try to pull this up again. Okay, good. So let me highlight some of those aspects of the video that's important for our discussion. The observer collapsed the wave function simply by observing. Light is either a particle or a wave based upon how it is measured. So the measurement itself changes it. There is no truth outside of the measurement. This is at the fundamental level of the natural world, so-called natural world. And so the social world is filled with far more bias in terms of if this is how electrons are deciding, the language of the video, deciding to act based upon observation. Humans are infinitely more thinking about how to respond based upon observation. So just an observer, so just the researcher asking questions, asking a survey is going to change how the person responds. Where the interview is conducted or the survey is conducted, or the experiment for that matter is conducted, is going to change the response. And this is happening not only to the researched, but the researcher. The researcher is going to have all these lack of control of their own bias or perspective based upon the social condition, whatever the condition of the research context is, wherever it is, and whenever it is. And this is also very much influenced by the things we talk about in this class, by racial identity, gender identity, all the kinds of power structures at play. So that's a huge critique of positivist science, that we can never eliminate bias, and just the act of research itself is going to affect the so-called data. So let's go on to another critique, that not only is objectivity sort of impossible, but the idea of neutrality or not having any values is also a delusion. So let's walk through this critique. So I already showed you that positivism is connected to the Enlightenment, and it does have values. It isn't value free. It values objectivity, control, and progress. So even right there, those are values that positivism has, and that scientists who are positivists have those values. They are trained in those values, and they might not be called those things, but they are at the assumption level of their training. Progress is something that has been connected to racism. The idea of progress, when we look at it in a deeper level, is always a question of whose progress, who gets to progress. Um, and the case study of scientific racism very much shows the ways that being so connected to progress that scientists cared about progress more actually than objectivity in their pursuit of finding who is the most intelligent race, that seeped into science and continues to seep into science. And we can see that the ways in which psychology was at the front of phrenology and eugenics. Phrenology is this pseudoscience that said that you can measure a person's head size and cranial capacity, and that you can therefore tell what their brains are made up of. Eugenics is this forced this idea that certain genes are good and other genes are not, and then practices of forced sterilization and a really ugly history connected to that in the United States and across the world. Psychology was at the forefront of both of those practices or communities of practice. And even at a time, certainly with eugenics of the 1930s, 20s and 30s and 40s, when behaviorism was a part of psychology. So psychology was saying it was neutral, value-free, but also it was heavily promoting eugenics. G. Stanley Hall, the first president of APA, was a eugenicist or promoted eugenics ideas. And the intelligence testing community also very much at the forefront. So the political values crept into science in the ways that these white supremacist scientists, even though they were saying that they didn't have any values, that this is just science, they were clearly promoting, and we can see that now looking back. It's like, oh, obviously these people were racists. But the question is, what are the political values within our current scientists? And the privilege of the idea of science is likely blinding the scientists to their own values. And so here is a sort of this idea of progression, the idea, and this was created by psychologists, this progression of life, the ascent of increasing intelligence. So how progress is embedded or imbued with these ideas of racism. Whose progress of who, and the ways that psychology has promoted this. Another case study of that science is not value free is the development of the A-bomb, the atomic bomb. And that story is a long story, but has a lot to do with the Manhattan Project in the United States and the development of a massive weapon in order to the thinking was around preventing the Nazi takeover of the world. But a closer look at the history also shows that what was at play was a desire for US hegemony over the world as well. And that some life on Earth mattered more than other life. And we saw that played out in the ways that the bomb was dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the way that only certain countries have this and other countries are prevented from having it. Those are values that are laden within the development of the A-bomb. I'm going to give you a little video, a 1-minute video of J. Robert Oppenheimer, the lead scientist, and him talking about now I am become death, and this idea of who has the power of life and death. And that's certainly, there are values laden with that question. Let me play this video.
We knew the world would not be the same. Few people laughed. Few people cried. Most people were silent. I remembered the line from the Hindu scripture, the Bhagavad Gita. Vishnu is trying to persuade the prince that he should do his duty, and to impress him takes on his multi-armed form and says, now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds. I suppose we all thought that one way or another.
So Oppenheimer says there that he likened himself to the prince, who, you know, is hearing from the God that now I am become death, like become death, do this, you have to do this, you have to kill these people in order for your people to live. And at this point, I'm not judging that in and of itself, actually, but I'm saying that there is a value there. There's values of whose life matters. There's a value of what tactics and techniques politics should be played out with. So, you know, war over diplomacy. And there's a particular reading of the world, like where is the danger of the world and danger to whom? This was contrasted. You can see the contrast with Einstein, another scientist who was actually like moving beyond positivism at this time of his life. And Einstein said that science should be anti-war, saying there's no hope in combating the production of specific weapons or means of destruction. Only radical abolition of war and of danger of war can help. Towards this goal, one should strive. In fact, no one should allow him or her or themselves to be forced into actions contrary to this goal. So Einstein is very much critiquing Oppenheimer here, and saying, Oppenheimer, you have shown your values, I'm showing mine, and that science is always laden with values, and let's be clear about that, which puts cracks into the idea of neutrality of science. So with all these critiques of positivism and our readings itself that we had for today said that positivism itself is a promoter of neoliberal ideologies, that it promotes ideas of individualism, progress again, productivity, you know, publish or perish. So, and like making power, money, whose evidence counts. So using it selectively. And so the idea here is not to use the expression, throw out the baby with the bathwater. Science is positive. Positive. Science, the idea of studying the world systematically and within a community, that's still very attractive and appealing to liberatory psychology, liberation. The idea is to move towards a critical science. And so what is a critical science? Well, one thing is that science should be transparent about having values and reflect on what they should be. So I talked about that already in contrasting Oppenheimer and Einstein. Einstein is saying, be transparent. What are the values? Name those values. Don't hide behind neutrality. And then let's talk about, as a scientific community, let's talk about what values we want. More on Einstein here, talking about Gandhi. Gandhi, the greatest political genius of our time, has shown the way and has demonstrated the sacrifices man is willing to bring if only he has found the right way. His work for the liberation of India is a living example that man's will, sustained by an indomitable conviction, is stronger than apparently invincible material power. So this is just to say, Einstein is clear about his values. Einstein was clear about having these socialist, critical, social justice values. And he said, we should all be this way because there's going to be some values. So let's look back at the chart, the philosophies of science, and let's talk about what critical science has for its assumptions. We already went through positivism's assumptions. So let's look at critical science and what is the social goal, the overall larger project of critical science. Critical science is based in the ideas of liberation and a study of oppression. So the social goals is that history shows cycles of oppression and liberation, and that those are sort of the drivers of society, not just the singular progress of humanity. But that history is cycles of liberation and oppression, and that the overall social goal is to bring these to light and be grounded within liberation. In terms of ontology, there is a promoting of liberation and social justice that is the sort of how, or in this case, the why of critical science, and that a little bit at a deeper level, in contrasting to the humans act rationally, is that humans can act in many different ways. They can act oppressively and they can act in terms of liberation. And what's important is to look at the social conditions and the historical conditions of why do humans act oppressive and why do they act in terms of liberation. They are capable of both. The goal of science itself should be to collaborate to create useful data for communities in struggle. So this is connected up to that social goal. We need to analyze oppression, and the data shouldn't just be for data's sake or for some theory somewhere or connected to the ivory tower. The data or whatever science we do should be useful. Science takes a lot of resources. Let's have it be useful for these social justice struggles, and let's ground it in creating a world that is connected to social justice and the questions of social justice. Finally, how is knowledge created and what counts as knowledge? So this value of neutrality, we say it's impossible, but what we can do is reflexivity. And let's be transparent. Let's be aware of power and have a critical reflection and practices to illuminate power and bias. And then let's have dialogues around how to move forward when power is complicated. But let's bring to light the power of the researcher, the power of the dominant society, the power differentials between researcher and researched. Those are the questions of reflexivity. So what makes good critical research? A lot of things, but we're going to talk about critical reflexivity in the rest of this lecture. So reflexivity, we can define it as reflections on and care for power and justice. And your social biography assignment is pushing you towards reflexivity. It's looking at your own positionality and how that's connected to power and oppression, and then looking also at ideologies. What ideologies are behind social practices? And let's talk about justice, and that it really starts with a sort of justice perspective. Who has power? Who doesn't? Who is being oppressed? Who has privilege? And so this isn't in the reading, but I find this useful, that reflexivity can be thought of at these three different levels. The personal level is at the researcher. This is in terms of research. The researcher's background informs the research. So who is the researcher is really important to critical research. What is their background? What are their goals? And what is their access to power? So we have to look at the researcher. And bias is okay. We don't think of it as bias. We think of it as subjectivity, and subjectivity is enriching. And we're going to look at that more as we go on in the next couple of readings. And it was touched upon in the readings today that those who face oppression, experiencing oppression and facing it, that's a bias, or that's a subjectivity. And that's really important, because if you face oppression, then you know the effects of research, and you can understand what should be the goal. For someone who's on the outside, they don't experience oppression, and they might want to be researching it, but it's the experiencing of it that can be so valuable in determining the research question and what should be done. Functional reflexivity means the identities of the researcher. And so I guess personal reflexivity is a little bit more just the own particular story of the researcher. What is their background? What are their goals? And what are their intentions? The functional reflexivity is their identities, their intersecting identities, and how that is connecting them to power or oppression. And then the disciplinary reflexivity is what is the social and political context? What impact on power will the research have? So research should have an impact on power. It should change power dynamics in the world. And if we're thinking about critical science, and it should be clear about that. So for this last part of the last sort of 10 minutes of the lecture, I'm going to go through my dissertation research, and it's informed by critical research. So it'll give us an example, and then we can look at what it does well and what it does not so well in terms of critical reflexivity. So my dissertation is called The White Man. The title of it is The White Man Problem, Exploring Concientización, Whiteness, and Masculinities with White Male-Identified Activists. And I'm going to share a little bit with you from this was a conference presentation a few years ago, and then we will dissect it for what it does well and not so well. So let's talk about white masculinity, and we have talked about this a little bit in class. The dominant form of white masculinity in our society is the hegemonic white masculinity, and it is connected to ideas of the wages of whiteness and the patriarchal dividend. So wages of whiteness, we mentioned that a few weeks ago when we were talking about racism, that whiteness divides the working class by giving white people a wage of whiteness. And sometimes it's material, sometimes it's economic benefits, but oftentimes it's a psychological benefit through racism, through thinking of oneself as superior. It's combined with a patriarchal dividend, which is sometimes economic, but it's also this psychological dividend as well, this male superiority. So typically white men are in this intersectional identity, internalize this. And when these wages of whiteness and patriarchal dividend are threatened through, diversity initiatives or social justice movement, or people out there on the streets marching for Black Lives Matter, there is often a retreat into whiteness and patriarchy. And we see that very clearly through the Republican Party, but it also happens in more subtle ways for white men, sort of across the board. And so these are large barriers towards white men being parts of social justice movements. But social identity is not destiny. There are some great examples of white men being allies or accomplices. The historical example of John Brown, the Paul Kivel, who's done a lot of writing and organizing around, like the ways that white people can be a part of racial justice movements, and Dean Spade's activism. And Dean Spade came up with a new book called Mutual Aid. And so there are some counter examples to this. And so my research was about, so how does this happen? How do white men take on white masculinity? What's different about them in their background? And this was informed by other studies that were out there. My mentor, Aaronette White's work with Black men, and there's some studies with white women as anti-racist accomplices as well. Learning from women of color and a deep commitment to anti-racist feminism are really important aspects of this. Relationship to women of color, private commitments, and public acts. So like mentorship seems to be a part of this for men of color and white women, and making private commitments. So doing the work, the sort of the psychological work, and then having public acts, standing up for one's value is really important. So my methodology was, here's my research question: how do anti-racist feminist white men understand their concientización? I sampled through a recruitment process. So I reached out to people in my network, mostly women of color, and sort of organizations that were promoting radical feminism, to see and asking them if they knew any such white men, like the John Brown, Dean Spade, Paul Kivels of the world, and whether or not they were actually, their not just rhetoric, but that their actions were, these white men's actions were consistent over time. It took me a long time to sample, and that long period of time indicates that this is an uncommon group, and also probably that it's well vetted. In the end, I had 16 activists ages 17 through 84, and the nomination process I just talked about. I did an interview with them, and it was an intensive life history interview, a long interview. And we talked about the turning points in their lives and their influences. And we got pretty deep, and these were very intimate interviews, where there was, a lot of emotion would come out for these men. And they were really powerful experiences for me as the researcher. And I heard back from the participants that the interview itself was a type of concientización in terms of the reflection piece of it. that they really appreciated. Don't know if you can see all this, but this gives a sense of who were the sample. They're different. These were pseudonyms that they gave themselves, their ages, how they identified in terms of race and ethnicity, their residence, their self-identified sexual identity, and their self-identified gender identity. And you can pause it here if you'd like to look at this further. I'm going to keep moving. So what were the big findings? The findings were in their life story. The crucial aspects of their coming to an anti-racist feminist consciousness and activism were marginality and critical education. Radical marginality was already in the literature. And what this means is that if one is marginalized, and this can come in many different forms. This could be like pushed out through oppression. This could be through bullying. This could be within the family or within society. There can be a radicalization that happens, and radical meaning a turn towards social justice, because one is on the outside. One can see the system for what it is, being on the outside. And so we saw this in my research through derogated identities. So this could be because they identified as LGBTQ or queer or disabled was another identity that they talked a lot, or some of them talked in depth about as being a part of their consciousness. But this could also occur through perceived identity, through when they were read as feminine growing up, or read as not having a masculinity that was, like a man, quote unquote. They could be bullied, and that started the process for some of them. But as we know, that in and of itself is not enough. That can, being bullied or having marginality can push a person toward the opposite direction, and toward the more violent and hegemonic white masculinity. So what was also important was critical education. And that means what we talk a lot about in this class, a concientización through, and a lot of this was it was a collective process through the groups that they were a part of, their activist groups, or the mentorship was crucial, having a mentor. And the mentorship could come not just from one mentor, but through many mentors, through comrades and through friends. And what was crucial in this concientización was engaging in intersectional practice. So understanding one's whiteness and masculinity gives privilege and is in a system, but that's not the end of the story. And that this privilege can be used towards social justice, which they hadn't understood earlier in their life. So I have quotes, but we don't have time for this at this point. And I sort of talked through all of this. So I want to lead to the more analysis of my dissertation through critical, whether it did a good job of reflexivity. So the research question, we already had this. I sort of already talked about my motivation for doing this study. You can pause it here if you'd like to look a little bit further into this. My personal reflexivity, the researcher's subjectivity and motivations are not biased, but can enrich. So my own background after undergrad, I came to activism. I was an activist and still am myself. And that informed my questions and my working with Dr. White. So this was good, my having an activist background, that I identify as an anti-racist feminist myself, or aspiring for those goals and how I live my life. That's a good thing for this research. Positivism would have read this as a negative, that I'm biased and that someone else should be doing this research, not me. This should be done by some scientist, and having this background of activism can only taint the research. Functional reflexivity, so that's my identities. We looking at my whiteness and maleness will shape any research I do. And I needed to think about how to build in practices of reflexivity. This project was selected for progressive use of whiteness and masculinity. So the ideas were to get more candid life stories in order to produce educational material for younger white men, to produce work that we could show past that the tough white guy doesn't have to be destiny, that there are other ways to be white and male that are connected to social justice work. So that having that and my own whiteness and maleness actually likely got these deeper stories from these men wanting to share with someone who was sort of on this path. And they said that quite often with me, that they felt a kinship for me. However, these can create blind spots as well, that there's places where I may have missed because I can't attend to all the sort of ways that I miss my privilege. So there's likely, I probably miss a lot of things, and this research likely would have been better if it was done in collaboration. However, dissertations are, always like one person doing it. So in the future, I would work with a research team and not just be one person. And the idea of who should I be accountable came up, which was an interesting one. Of course, I want to be accountable to feminist and anti-racist movements. But sometimes the men themselves, there's critical research also says you should be accountable to your participants as well. But sometimes there's tension. If part of what came out was maybe one of my participants said something racist, then how should I would probably want to share that if I'm accountable to social movements. But if I'm accountable to that person, that participant, then maybe they don't want that shared. So I have to navigate that tension. And I navigated it through member checks, which was once I did the analysis, then I took it. And even if it was harsh, then I took it back to the participant and shared it with them, and then asked them if they had how it landed with them, and also if they had counter arguments or counter perspectives. And I wove both perspectives into the dissertation. Disciplinary reflexivity, ideas of solidarity and growing social movements, a big discussion in most movements. So this was my dissertation was in the larger question of social movements and identity work in social movements. My motivation being connected to my mentor, Dr. White's work with Black men who identify as feminist. So I wanted this work to be in conversation with the social movements. I was motivated by creating more authentic solidarity activism, that I think that we can learn from activists. How are activists learning from feminism and social justice? How are these white men taking in what they were learning from classes like this or ethnic studies, feminist movements, and what was it looking like for them in their lives? And we didn't have any other research like this. This is the question of reframing the gaze of research. And white men have been studied a lot and way too much in so many ways, but they hadn't been studied in terms of these research questions, the gaze being turned. And so my research, the findings were, they're interesting, that some of it was like, yeah, they're doing these certain things well, but then also I have a chapter on where are they sort of not, where are they, the limitations of their activism. So I think the motivations to grow social justice movements, that's a critical, being grounded in that as a goal seems positive for social justice movement. But the impact of the research that after grad school, I still haven't published any of this or put this out in the world besides my dissertation, and that's negative. And that's something that I need to be doing better on and putting this out there in the world. It has a lot to do with neoliberalism, that I am an instructor, a lecturer, and not a research scientist. And so lecturing has been demanding, but I still desire to put this out there in the world. And I have an ethical mandate that I need to put this out there in order to grow social justice movements. So summary, quantum mechanics and critical thinking lead to the ideas that there is no such thing as bias. How we measure always affects the results. Critical science says, instead of ignoring, hiding this, let's not just sweep this under the rug, but so-called objectivity is, if we can get there, or something that is more objective, then we need to be transparent, aware, and inquisitive of subjectivity, not try to hide it. But it's in a relationship to objectivity. Your definition of science depends on your view of the world and your values. So you may have values that line up with positivism. You may have values that line up with critical theory and critical science. And that is it for the lecture. I'm out of breath, and it seems like that's long enough. I look forward to your questions and comments around this. Okay, have a great day.